So good evening, everyone. My name is Osho Brad, and I'm one of the priests with the Dragonfly Sangha. And this evening, I'd like to kick off a series of talks that my fellow priest Osho Mike and I will lead around some of the basic teachings of our community, of the Dragonfly Sangha. And so a little bit about us and about our Buddhist community. We were founded about 25 years ago in 1997. And we are a Navayana tradition. So you may have heard words like Mahayana, meaning great vehicle, or Hinayana, meaning smaller vehicle. Navayana essentially means new vehicle. And so we're a more contemporary expression of the Dharma, with roots in the Japanese Zen and Shin traditions. We have communities, several communities around the U.S., Pennsylvania, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Florida, Nevada, and folks all around the world who practice with us as a part of our spiritual community. So like I said, we're a modern expression of the Dharma, and one of the things that I like about our practice is that we use a lot of psychotherapeutic language to expound upon the Buddha's teachings, because Buddhism is at its core a very psychotherapeutic tradition and practice, right? And it's very easy when it comes to Buddhism, a tradition like ours, to kind of lose to lose ourselves in some of the religious forms, the smells and bells, as we sometimes refer to them. So incense, pictures and statues of different Buddhas, chants and liturgy and meditation and things like that, and say, oh, I'm doing it, right? But when it comes down to it, the core of Buddhist practice is to truly and freely live out of our Buddha nature, or our true self. So, like I said, I want to talk or start a series of talks about some of our basic teachings. And so we're going to discuss some of these in the next few videos, and hope that we can clearly explain some of these concepts. But we do encourage you to practice, because it is one thing to understand some of these principles intellectually, but when you start to reflect and apply it to your life and your way of seeing the world, you can really take them to heart and experience real change. So let me begin by sort of defining a few terms that we'll talk about over the next few weeks. And I specifically want to focus on the ego self, because you hear us talk a lot in Buddhism about the ego and Buddha nature, or the ego self and the true self. And so I want to start by discussing the ego self. I know when I first started practicing and studying the Dharma, I heard a lot of people say, oh, the goal of Buddhism is to destroy the ego, or that the ego doesn't really exist. And while we do believe that the ego is empty of permanence, and you've heard me talk about that before, empty of sort of independent existence, it does exist, right? And we don't want to destroy it. We don't want to obliterate our ego. We want to be compassionate towards our ego and express our true self, our Buddha nature, through the uniqueness that is our ego self. And to live through our ego self, we need to understand how the ego came to be, and some of the principles behind how the ego kind of works. So I want to talk a bit about the origin of the ego self. And I want to do this in a few ways. First, through the Buddhist teachings of the skandhas, and then how we in the Dragonfly Sangha sort of further interpret the five skandhas. So if you're not familiar with the skandhas in Buddhism, the word skandha essentially means heaps or aggregates. It's the five things, the stuff, the groups of stuff that make up the ego self. We typically refer to these five things as form, sensation, perception, volition, and consciousness. So form is kind of what we're made of, our matter, our material, right? Sensation are our senses, so the five senses, and then of course the sixth sense of the thought of thinking. Perception is our ability to identify things. Volition is when we're qualifying things as good or bad or neutral. We're developing an opinion about them, kind of starting to make up our mind about them, so to speak. And then consciousness, the fifth skandha, is our sense of self. I like to think of the fifth skandha as the fire that burns on the other four, right? Our fire identity. You can think of it as. Now, in our order, in the Dragonfly Sangha, like I said, we further interpret the skandhas using a psychological and developmental lens. So we think of them sort of linearly as we develop as human beings. So when we're born, we think about that first skandha of form. And this is our genetic heritage. So it's not only the stuff that makes us up, but we want to think about that first skandha in terms of what we got from our parents and our grandparents and our great-grandparents, right? It's a lot of good things, maybe some things that we don't particularly like. Maybe we wish we were taller, wish we were shorter or thinner or what have you. But one of the reasons it's important to think about the skandha of form, this first phase in our development, as what we bring with us that we didn't necessarily choose, is because we sometimes have thoughts about the way that we are, that we wish we were different. I wish I wasn't so angry, or I wish I didn't have this health issue, or I wish I wasn't depressed. And we think, well, I'm just going to force myself to be well, or I'm going to force myself to be happy. Or people may tell us, like, why don't you just smile more, right? And it's important to acknowledge that we may have a predisposition to certain conditions that are outside of our control. And when it comes to mental conditions, there might be a case for treatment, such as medicine, that goes along with things. And so we acknowledge that within our tradition that, when it comes to mental health, Buddhist practice may just be part of what helps you, and that there might be other things that you may need to work on and take to kind of help you be well. So that's the first skandha, is form, our birth, the things we bring with us. The second skandha of sensation, this phase is birth to about the age of 7 or 8. And we typify this particular skandha by yin or feminine energy. It's often derived or kind of rooted from our mothers, or, our biological mothers, or the person playing the maternal role in our upbringing, right? So this is our development of our emotional and our physical senses when we're very young. Our perception then, this skandhic phase, is age about 8 to 12 or 13, and where the skandha of sensation is focused on the yin or feminine energy. The skandha, this third skandha of perception, is focused on the yang or the masculine energy, and similarly is related to one's father, or the person who played the role of a father, that paternal role in your life growing up. Pardon me. And so this is when we're developing some of our perceptions of the outside world and the things around us. Now, the fourth skandha, volition, typically in our development, this is ages 13 to 14 to around 25. This is really when we're crafting our relationship to our environment and starting to determine our place in the world, so to speak. So now we're starting to compare ourselves to others, right? And make some of our choices and decisions and actions based on those comparisons and our perception of our place in the world. And then the fifth skandha, or the fifth phase in our development, begins to emerge in the third or fourth phase, but really culminates around age 25, which also happens to be the time around when our brain is finished developing. And this is when we tend to have that sense of, this is who I am, this is my identity, right? That sense of consciousness. Now, in Buddhism, this aggregation of elements and developments, these phases of growth, constitute the ego self, and what we mean by the ego self. And maybe as I was walking through some of those descriptions, you thought, oh yeah, okay, I see myself in that. I definitely felt like I had a better sense of myself, in that later part of my life, around 25. Maybe you have children, and you can see in them, oh yeah, they're definitely in this skandhic phase. And so it's something that we, it's an element of development that we use for interpreting and adding more depth to the skandhas and the formation of the ego self. Now, once we have that sense of self, we generally want things to be stable, right? We try to maintain that as best as we can. Now, things happen, they rock our boat a little bit, but they generally have a way of leveling out. The same way that, you disturb a surface of water, it'll eventually go smooth again, right? Our psyches, then, our egos, they have that natural tendency towards stability as well. Just like how we may lose our balance, but then we kind of steady ourselves, right? However, certain experiences really are particularly destabilizing on us. In our practice, we call them eruptions. And there are really 4 eruptions that we acknowledge that we all experience, at least one of these, most of us, probably all of them, at some point in our lives. And they tend to kind of wake us up a little bit and make us realize, ooh, things aren't always going to be the way that I expect them to be. When I sort of establish my sense of self, and the way that I thought my ego would always kind of level out. Those 4 eruptions are relationships, aging, mortality, and anxiety and depression. The first one, relationships, this is typically an eruption caused by our first mature relationship. Could be a romantic relationship or marriage. It changes our perception of the world. Having a child is also an incredibly powerful experience for a person to have, an incredibly powerful relationship to have. The eruption of aging, this is when we're getting older, maybe things are harder for us than they used to be, or we're experiencing people around us getting older and things are changing, right? The third eruption is mortality, so a serious illness, maybe a near-death experience, or the death of someone close to us is an incredibly powerful experience, and destabilizing experience. And then the last one is anxiety or depression. And this can have a lot of different causes. Anything that brings about intense distress or sadness. Could be, economic stress. Could be socio-political strife. Things around you that you see that make you incredibly upset and make you seek out some kind of stability that you don't seem to be able to find by way of your ego. Sometimes we look for religious or social absolutes. We just want some hard and fast rules. Someone tell me what to do. Tell me what's right and wrong. And we have a harder time kind of riding the boat because our sense of the world and our place in it has been challenged. Now, oftentimes we look at these eruptions as something purely negative, and certainly they're hard, they're difficult. But they're also an opportunity for us to deepen our awareness of who we are, and align ourselves to something more stable than our ego self, specifically our true self, which Osho Mike will discuss in next week's talk a bit more. So this sort of development of the ego self and the way that we seek stability, sometimes get rocked a little bit, but generally seek stability. This is our basic programming, you can almost think. It's sort of like our interaction of our hardware and our software a little bit, the way that we generally go about things. because the ego self in some regards can be kind of predictable, and this way of experiencing the world through the ego is something that we call the process or the cycle of causal origination. Because we notice as the ego experiences the world that the same kind of cycle seems to run, the same program almost kind of seems to run. And the way that it runs is like this. And this cycle that we experience kind of goes like this. We experience things in the world. We experience them enough times that we start to notice patterns. We expect certain things to happen, right? Holidays are fun. Birthdays are nice. That person's cool. That person's not so cool. That type of person I like or don't like, right? We have these patterns. These patterns then become beliefs. This is the way the world is. This is the way that I am. And as our days unfold, we experience, or the things that we experience cause thoughts to arise in our minds. And those thoughts very quickly manifest themselves as feelings. I'm angry, I'm sad. These feelings present themselves both psychically and somatically, meaning that we both think them and we feel them, right? We have that moment of, ooh, in my gut, I feel this thing, or oh, I have tension in my head, right? So we feel, our bodies are emotional as well, right? Based on those feelings, we take actions. Our actions tend to be aggressive or passive, and how we take action tends to rely a bit on our on nature and nurture. So if you're more extroverted, you might tend to act more aggressively and act out against things. If you tend to be more introverted, you may have a more passive behavior, which means that you withdraw from things. But withdrawal is still an action. And then, of course, those actions, whether they're aggressive or passive, they have consequences. Those consequences lead to additional experiences, and the cycle repeats, right? The experiences lead to thoughts. The thoughts lead to feelings. The feelings manifest as actions. Actions lead to consequences. Consequences to experiences over and over again, right? Now, out of all of the things in that cycle, the one that's probably the easiest for us to notice and the one that trips us up the most are feelings, right? We notice when there are feelings. I wish I didn't get so angry at that person. I feel down, but I don't know why. And our feelings often arise so quickly after our thoughts that we don't even think that our thoughts are there. It's just a gut reaction, right? I feel this way. And sometimes because of how quickly our feelings present themselves in our lives, we feel that they're sort of naturally or morally fixed and justified. I'm righteous in my anger. I can't help it that I feel this way. But our feelings really don't exist without thoughts. And so our thoughts are where we need to focus our attention. And to kind of, to back this up, I want to very briefly paraphrase the opening lines of the Dhammapada. Because there are times where I think, when I'm feeling conflicted or I'm dealing with something challenging, and I keep thinking like, oh, I just wish I could change that thing, that I have to remember these opening lines. And they are, all experiences preceded by mind, led by mind, made by mind. Speak or act with a corrupted mind, and suffering follows, as the wagon wheel follows the hoof of an ox. And on the flip side of that, it goes on to say, speak or act with a peaceful mind, and happiness follows, like a never-departing shadow. And so in the Dragonfly Sangha, our basic teachings are focused on freeing our mind from the delusions that our feelings are fixed and that we can't help them or do anything about them. And our practices are focused more on how can we suss out the thoughts that are driving those feelings, and how can we then, in so doing that, live out of our true self, have our true self, our Buddha nature, manifest itself through our ego, and not just have this constant rocking of the boat, but doing that finding that stability and taking actions that can change that cycle of causal origination. It takes inquiry, and it takes practice, and it takes time. So over the next few weeks, Osho Mike and I will be discussing some models that describe the thought patterns we experience on a daily basis, the thought patterns that tend to be behind the feelings that we experience on a daily basis, and how those models can help us better understand the source of those feelings and what's happening in the ego and the dynamism between the ego self and the true self. And then how, based on that understanding, we can take action, creative and experimental action, to form new, more helpful, and more compassionate thoughts. So I hope, as always, that these teachings were helpful. If you'd like to learn more about our practice, or would like someone to talk to, please do visit us online. AskSenseiTony.com or DragonflySangha.com. And of course, everything that I spoke about here this evening, and everything that Mike will be talking about in his Dharma talks, can be found in the book that lays out the teachings of our order, Free Your Mind, by Sensei Anthony Stultz. So I hope you all have a great week, and I will see you again to talk a bit further about some of the mindfulness models that are a part of the Dragonfly Sangha. Thank you.